Good evening. Welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm Richard Sommer, the Dean of the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. This is our final public lecture of the year. Last, but certainly not least, we're proud to present one of our own faculty, Professor Shane Williamson. Shane has been teaching here at the faculty since 1999. That was the last century. And I think it's fair to say that Shane represents the extent to which the model of the teacher practitioner is now being renewed at the faculty through individuals that are taking on a new combination of university-based research and professional practice. As many of you might know, Shane's firm, Williamson Chong, whose work ranges from furniture design to master planning, has received a great deal of recognition in recent years. Before delving into their many accomplishments, I'd like to point out that the other principals of the firm are right here in the front row, and they've joined us tonight. Donald Chong, who's an alumnus of the faculty and also has taught here and is a frequent guest critic. And Betsy Williamson, who is also an adjunct member of the faculty. So they're all a part of our big family here. So Williamson Chong have been on an incredible upward trajectory. In just the last year alone, they have received the following awards: a Canadian Architect Award of Excellence, 3 Residential Architecture Design Awards from the American Institute of Architects, an Emerging Architecture Practice Award from the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada, and an Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League of New York. So that's a lot of emerging, and so they might actually be floating while we're actually, just prior to that, the firm was awarded in 2012. They were awarded the Professional Prix de Rome in architecture, one of the most prestigious honors given to a young architecture firm that demonstrates exceptional artistic potential. This award allowed Shane and his colleagues to explore the use of new, innovative wood technologies, in particular design opportunities inherent in the use of cross-laminate timber. And we saw the results of some of their research this past fall in an exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery, which, among other things, explored wood's material history. I think this is related to that up on the screen. At the time, the Globe and Mail wrote, quote, "For a small architecture practice, making such strides in wood construction, not to mention its artistic application, is a rare accomplishment. Yet Williamson Chong, after barely 4 years in business, has managed to close in on something of a golden rule," end quote. In the article, Betsy suggested that the golden rule involves, quote, "an uncompromising critical outlook," unquote, and she attributes this way of thinking specifically to Shane, saying, "He's the feedback loop in the office, always saying, we could really do this a little bit better, or take it a bit further." So Shane's drive to always push a bit further extends to his teaching here as well, and I can tell you that our students reap the benefit of Shane's intensity and his exacting approach towards design. Over the past decade, Shane's research has focused on situating digital fabrication and wood construction within a broader cultural context. His work has been funded by the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, the National Research Council of Canada, Networks of Excellence of Canada, and the Canada Council for the Arts. Williamson Chong's work has been published in Architecture, Architectural Record, Azure, Canadian Architect, Domus, Dwell, ID, Metropolis, Praxis, and Thresholds, among, I think, some other places. Both Shane's work and the work of the firm has been exhibited at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., the Municipal Center for the Arts in New York, Mercer Union, Toronto, Design Exchange in Toronto, the ONI space in Chicago, their gallery in Chicago, and the Urban Center in New York. Now, I want to share that my first real encounter with Shane was not, as I recall, so much in person, although I think we may have met, but through a project he did while still a student at Harvard GSD, working with one of the architects for One Spadina, Nader Tehrani, and then in practice with Monica Ponce de Leon. Shane helped devise the system for designing and fabricating these beautiful undulating wood panels that form the surfaces of the administrative offices at the Harvard GSD, which included my own office as a director. So every day I'd open and close all sorts of drawers and doors and panels, and I think actually a lot about the mind that had figured out how to make these things work. Later, when I moved here, I was able to see some of the incredible work that Shane and Betsy were doing, and also some incredibly elegant houses done separately by Donald Chung. So when they joined their firms, it made great sense to me, not only because of their shared design sensibilities, but because, frankly, each of their three personalities is so different. And I'm not going to elaborate on how that works, but I am certain that their distinct talents and personalities come in very handy when balancing the competing demands of designing, managing clients, building, and engagement with the public. So it is a real pleasure for me to see people with such an appetite for experimentation through the craft of architecture, especially someone like Shane, who has been able to use the digital turn in architecture in ways that transcend some of the parametric novelties that were so much in the air just yesterday, and frame a more lasting project. What seems most encouraging and worth celebrating is how Williamson Chung is finding such a growing reception and support for their work. So please join me in welcoming Shane to the podium.
Thank you, Richard, for the generous introduction. I didn't know you that well when I had worked on those filing cabinets, and one of the missing components were the absence of, these were filing cabinets, which I'm not showing tonight, with the absence of any tags or identification. So I felt that like I'd left these walls of cabinets and for the administration without any way of finding what was in each of the drawers. And
that's why I had to fumble around.
I know, so it's a pleasing thought, I guess, that you were thinking of me each time you were trying to find these pieces. Well, it's a pleasure to be speaking here. It's oddly a very rare opportunity, although I've been teaching here for more than a decade. The opportunities for those of us on the inside to speak publicly turns out to be fairly few and far between. So I think the last time I spoke, it was shortly after I had been hired, and certainly the scope of work has changed. And as our dean had indicated, I'm, of course, a part of a practice that has three partners, and we do have very distinct differences amongst ourselves. I'm not going to elaborate amongst our differences, but it's fair to say that when hearing my voice tonight, it's very much my voice and my own reading of our work that would be very different if Betsy or Don were presenting the work. And sometimes when we present as a trio, I guess it can be fairly charged in that context. So the image on the left, of course, there's nothing staged about that image. That's how we work every day, standing up, reviewing work. And the image on the right, a part of our travels that associated with the Rome Prize. And what's interesting is that our practice, outside of this kind of issue of criticality, our practice is largely based on friendship as well. It's curious that Betsy and I had known Don for years, and interestingly enough, we never talked architecture, and we never argued about architecture at the time, and we did fairly pleasant things, kind of part of our real world. So there's a bit of a challenge in asking, kind of seeking out a partnership if one would damage that relationship, and that hasn't been the case to date. Now, prior to our merger, of course, we. It's admittedly with our awards last year, we apparently are emerging, but prior to emerging, we were something else. We were at least starting, that we did have a handful of projects under our belt separately. Betsy and I had been practicing together, and Don had his individual practice. And to some degree, we felt that our diversity would make us bigger and stronger. So rather than compete for a lot of the small work, which we had been competing for in the city, we sought to merge our practices. Now, having said that, there were two notable projects. The houses, the first image and the third image, had given us each a notable acclaim. They were our first projects as practices, and in some ways, these projects, which I will discuss later, set the tone for much of our work to date. Now, there is a moment, I remember George Baird asked Patricia Paco, well, there's a real challenge in academia, with mergers and couples working together about the rules of authorship, and particularly in the degree to which academia privileges the individual. I mean, Bell Canada somehow, introduces very early on the problems that would be faced with our merger and the absence of that identity. But somehow, we do tend to work together. And the challenges haven't been so much. This is some of our early trips to Algonquin, and part of our challenges haven't been so much about our differences, but doing things like starting a practice at the same time when you have a child. In the same year, Betsy and I started our practice. We had our daughter Ellery, and we bought our first house. And so I would say that perhaps we haven't made the best decisions timing-wise, but the merger in our practice has certainly been productive. Now, at this point over the past year, when we have been presenting our work outside of the context of Toronto, we tend to make a very big deal of Toronto. And even to some degree, we exploited Rob Ford. He's a great character in this regard. But tonight, so normally we would talk about, even as a kind of new practice, we talk about our projects in the city and the role that they play in the city and the role that typology plays in that. But tonight is really about our practice. Of course, I'll be showing work based in Toronto, but it's really about Williamson Chong. And when thinking about our practice, it is impossible not to note those individuals who produce much of the work that comes out of our office. And so left to right, we have Eric C., Paul Harrison as Betsy, and myself, Dimitra Papantonis, Chris Routley, and that's Don on the right side. So we are a small practice, a small and productive practice. And I should note that, even when I state and I say that we're a small practice and that, and that we are emerging, that I struggled a bit tonight putting the slides together and thinking about some of the cross relationships between the work, and I ultimately decided that I'm going to present the work at scale, essentially, from small to big. And for us, big is relative, but there is a future where things will be big. I'll make some connections between this work, but do understand that as I'm presenting it, it really is moving from the small to the not so small. And so most recently, we had an exhibition at the Corking Gallery, and it was the result of about 2 years of travel and research that was funded by the Canada Council for the Professional Prix de Rome. And we visited a number of places, very interesting institutions and research-based, looking at emerging wood technologies around the world. And in considering what we would do for this exhibition, rather than deploying some, in fact, something like cross-laminated timber, we, in fact, kind of decided to step back a bit and look at the history of wood and wood construction. And considering the history of wood, one could think of dendricology and the study of tree rings. And in particular, what was, because this is so pervasive when one is kind of looking at wood, the kind of the flood of images and tree rings. One thing that was of interest to us were the possibilities of the reading of the geometry of tree rings, particularly when they fall into a kind of eccentric mode. And already this notion of eccentricity is in some way informed by understanding there's a part of an endgame for this project, which I'll be showing, which is looking for geometric potential. But the one thing that's very interesting is that one can look at eccentricity within tree rings and understand the history of a site based on the mass movement of landscape or other natural effects like wind or erosion. And so we see in this diagram just the nature and orientation of the tree produces a fairly eccentric reading. And so we see on the image on the left 2 modes of eccentricity within a trunk. One mode based in erosion, the other based in the landscape, and then the image on the right showing us that even with this eccentricity, we see the effects on the bark structure on the left side of the oblong side. And so, thinking about the possibilities of this, clearly there is a mode of abstraction that becomes initiated here, and This skips a couple of slides here, but let me. There is this notion of the reading of a landscape and eccentricity. And so with the image on the top, we see a diagram showing what can consider with the circles being the base of the tree, and then the orientation of the trunk is moving. And this registers in a limited field of each of these circles, the depth of which is related to the depth of an underlying surface, and the eccentric element of the circles based on the orientation of the trunks themselves. So there were nearly 200 of these elements, each of which are unique. They are kind of basic. They register through subtractive modes of fabrication each of the eccentric elements of the relationship of the trunk itself, and this established a kind of very limited. Let's say, limited by this grid, a limited reading of the difference and eccentricity within this field. There was a correlating series of prints that were generated that sought to greater exploit the density of this field without the limitation of the grid. And in this case, when you see a light circle through this field, like for example here, somewhere up here is a corresponding dark circle that one could imagine is the bottom of a tree trunk and the top of a tree trunk somewhere up in this field. And so in each of these images, there is an underlying and sometimes a fairly complicated surface, but that surface begins to register the effects of eccentricity alone. And there were a handful of these images generated. And so things like this, in terms of this kind of generative mode of thinking, there was something, I think there were about 3 million circles in a drawing like this. It does speak to a greater relationship within the field. And so, this is actually one of the more recent pieces that we've done. But right with our merger, we were asked to participate in an exhibition that was at the Workspace Gallery that's run by Larry Richards, to participate in an exhibition that focused on Chinese embroidery. And what's very interesting about this type of embroidery is that it's really, it's tremendously sophisticated irrespective of its pictorial representation. There is a mode of this embroidery where in fact that more sophisticated models in fact represent an image on one side and a secondary image on the back side. And the more sophisticated versions of these in fact don't work from a base template. They in fact are something more like drawing rather than working from a base image. And looking to kind of exploit this notion of the pictorial, but with an emphasis upon the methodology and say the depth of movement of a needle through a screen, we looked at a series of images and applied sometimes a loose logic, sometimes a tighter logic to the extraction of certain elements, let's say RGB values from the image to create a field. And then this field condition produces a sense of connectivity, which in essence creates a kind of thickened condition. And this thickened condition early on was something that we were interested in. So rather than a flat plane, it's as if we're looking at something that's embroidered in perspective and in the depth of the embroidery. And this is one of more or less of a temporal image from the one image that I was showing you before, working through this field. And there were a number of studies associated with the kind of extraction of this information from these base images. And they produced fairly extraordinary results, much of which is invested in the notion of a point and a line associated with embroidery itself. This aspect of our installation resulted in a series of images that looked to kind of parcel out, and not so much clearly to represent an image per se, but the depth and sophistication of a series of conflicting and converging lines. And these were presented as a series of prints within the exhibition. There's that's a particularly long fade. Okay, so the second part of this exhibition looked at the idea of extracting three-dimensional information from a four-dimensional construct. In this case, it's a quaternion Julia set. And so what's interesting about this is that we're seeing a ray-traced iteration of geometry. So every instance that we're seeing, like this image doesn't know much about the three-dimensionality of the object other than the image that it's representing. And so what's novel about this approach, and this work is actually was done, Alton Byrne, who of course is teaching with us now, was in the office, and this is an aspect of work which we collaborated with Alton, is taking this notion of ray tracing and capturing an image, is that we were able to take multiple views. So the gray square that you see here is the orientation of a single view, and through hundreds of these views, capturing points, essentially the static, the two-dimensional image that we associate from ray tracing. And each of these iterations begins to capture a number of points. I mean, these resulted in text files that were gigabytes in size, and produced rather wonderful images of their kind of point cloud configurations. And it wasn't so much that we were reacting or changing the geometry of the quaternion Julia fractal, but that we were looking at producing these three-dimensional artifacts, which were quite novel at the time, because again, these things are often only visualized through view-specific modes and ray tracing. Along with this exhibition, and something that is impossible to show on screen, was a holographic representation of this as well, and the whole language of this was one that's based on two-dimensional and three-dimensional constructs for the exhibition itself. Now, we, as a practice as well, separately had participated in the interior design show for a number of years, and there's a lot of sweat equity involved in these booths, essentially, and we did several of the idea spaces separately, as Betsy and I and Don had done one as well. And we were asked, again, early upon our merger to produce a booth in consideration of a line of windows for a window manufacturer. And so, typically as architects, we'd ask, well, what's the largest size windows that you can produce? And they supplied those windows. And the geometry of this installation is really the net result, is kind of reconciling between all of the maximum geometries of the window systems available from the manufacturer. And so we see a number of views, and you can see the kind of tessellated geometry that kind of results from the varying systems that comprise the envelope. Now, in considering things like windows, you're equally invested in the notion of window profiles, and we knew that we wanted to have a kind of smaller installation within the space itself. And so this is a fairly random set of images, but there was this notion that we would produce a piece that might hang on the wall within the space itself. And this kind of notion of what could hang on the wall, there was kind of an idea of a bear rug that we could kind of make at the time. But what was curious about this is thinking about the notion of hybridization between something like a bear rug and the possibility, and thinking about the window profiles, of investigating something like one of Rorschach's ink blot tests. And this notion of psychological profiling, the notion of the window profiles, potentially this idea of the Canadian notion of the bear rug hanging on the wall. And if you're not familiar with this was fairly controversial when these 10 slides were released, because they're the base slides for the Rorschach tests. And one of these, I don't believe the one that I selected, deems your compatibility with your mate. Now, in considering the window profiles, there's this idea that ours, in fact, was an additive process with these oblique cuts through the profiles themselves, where, of course, with a bare skin rug, it's a very subtractive process and the skinning. And this was the final piece itself. So based on symmetry, and actually there's really nothing digital in this exercise. It was something that we crafted by hand within the office. So changing in scale, and there are a handful of projects which I'll be showing tonight, which in fact are losses, things that we've participated in competitions and have not won. This was an entry that we had put in for the Jardin de Métier, and it built off of an earlier project which we had produced for the interior design show, where we had looked at something equivalent to a digital grotto. But the idea for this grotto was that it would produce a space of respite, so we see a view from above and then a view from below that would be located within a fairly defined parcel of land, and would be populated with a variety of species of moss, which on the interior of this geometry, as it relates to the curvature, so this is kind of a cut and splayed version of the geometry, the moss would be deployed based on certain light amenities within the space. And so, I mean, here we see that, so in the notion of the grotto within an Italian garden is one that, in front of the artifice of stone, is that here we find a very soft and supple surface within this polygonal box with a view to the top, and there's this juxtaposition of the charred wood, essentially the death of cedar in a way, and the growth of the moss on the interior. And we see the threshold entry into this piece. So working forward in scale, I would say that I'm going to present now a typology which we have been interested in for a very long time, and this is a typology of looking at the dog trot, and I'll show some images of this suddenly. But we took an opportunity to participate in a competition in Cape Cod for which we were finalists, and this competition gave us a great opportunity to stay within some of the modern houses that they are renovating. And this is the Kugelgips house, and our daughter Ellery looking particularly uninterested in being at this house right now, but I think she did enjoy the trip. And the context of this competition was to produce accessory buildings for people who lived in Cape Cod, that they could, the role of these dwellings could be to provide housing for temporary workers. It's a very seasonal workforce in Cape Cod, but it could also address the idea of empty nesters who could move out of their larger houses to live in these accessory buildings and rent out their houses for more income. And, in reacting to the kind of the modern context of the houses that were being renovated there, of course, what we brought to the table at the time was something antithetical to that, and it was looking at the dog trot typology. It's a typology of a house that exists in the southern United States, and it takes on many different faces, but of course, it's the open breezeway, which is the characteristic of the dog trot, normally with flanking program of having a living room and a kitchen on the right-hand side. Years ago, Betsy and I had worked on a project where, in fact, it was an accessory building, 110 square foot accessory bunkie for various sites in Ontario, and that diagram at the top was it's a very simple notion that when I'll call this when closed, the breezeway has access through the space, but with these sliding doors, actually close the breezeway, it creates a much larger space, affording us a much greater space than the 110 square feet, which is right here, which is what zoning bylaws dictate. Now, for this competition, titled Add-on, what we were looking at, in fact, is a much larger iteration of the dog trot with a very specific notion of the of a program that needed to be accommodated. Very simple. In fact, it's still a one-bedroom program. We can see the pronounced open breezeway here. One thing that is significant about this plan as well is that it sought to use SIP technologies for easy deployment. And there was kind of an overriding interest in the affordability for this accessory housing. And a rendering showing the kind of engagement on one of the sites. This is a site just for the single deployment of the dog trot. And here we can see the possibility of, for example, of a panel that is able to close down the space for greater privacy. But the whole system, again, and this isn't necessarily reflected here because it's clad after the panels go up, is really quite efficient. And in terms of passive strategies, it's really quite strong in the dog trot because of the main breezeway that pulls through. But we are occupying the upper space. In this case, a space up here that can be for a bedroom or a workspace. And there are a number of operable skylights that kind of can pull air through. So, in this case, the proposal, in fact, operates very closely to an existing typology, and it did become very interesting to us when there's this idea of a variety of scale change and seeing these dog trots set up linear, where the breezeway itself now becomes the connective tissue between, and you can see this kind of more clearly in this rendering. And this site was truly unspectacular. So we were looking to create a fairly kind of insular condition and a relationship between these fairly easily deployed houses. One of the products that we have in the office now seeks to play on the notion of the dog trot typology while being a bit more responsive to the idea of landscape. In this case, it's a very kind of direct relationship to the existing contours on a site and the overriding sensibilities, programmatic sensibilities of the client. In this case, although it's very difficult to read on the screen, you should note that the master suite is on the left-hand side and all of the kids are on the right-hand side for reasons of privacy. And there's this idea of taking this linear program and adapting it to the fairly extraordinary topography of this site, and addressing some of the subtle manipulations, and in doing so, allowing a bit of the geometry of a pitched roof typology to play and create a crenellated surface on the outside of the building. And so we see this is really operating as a guest house on this site. We see the net result of this permutation with the two bars. Now, of course, the left-hand side and the right-hand side are close together, closer than they were as in a line. But it's this merger of the 2 points which produces, in fact, this is the kitchen and living room are right here. And there's a view through this part. We'll see in plan, this is the kitchen and a bit of an outdoor deck. That this becomes the more meaningful image respective of the dog trot typology, where we see a single, this is not an open breezeway, but a single point of view through an opaque side of the house, which is meant to kind of maintain some privacy for the entry, and produces a very opaque condition on the entry side. Here are a variety of sections with the house itself, and you'll note there are a number of very similar sections to the add-on proposal, dog trot proposal that we were looking at before. But what's interesting on the back side is that there's a playfulness now with this typology of the pitch roof, which produces a number of crenellated moments on this exterior skin, all of which become opportunities for exterior decks while providing coverage from the elements. And this is the house in Frog's Hollow that Betsy and I designed and built in 2007, 9, starts 2000, around that time. And when we were approached, and again, working through in scales, and this is now making a kind of statement about relationship of buildings to landscape, because as I move through the presentation, there's going to be a kind of a different reaction to, say, typology and the city. But this is located up in the Collingwood area, and the clients were avid cyclists. They have a very intimate relationship with the landscape. And they also had a desire to avoid the view of a neighboring condition. There's a house adjacent on this very big lot that they would rather not see from their new house. And so they had asked us to kind of seek opportunities to engage the building into the landscape. And so this is perhaps one of the very first kind of schematic renderings that we had proposed to them respective of this engagement. And there's this idea that there would be a lower level which have a view out to the landscape to the right, and that there would be a land bridge of sorts which would connect to a family room and bedrooms on the second level. And what's surprising from that image is how close over time it remained, even as the project developed. And we see from this side, of course, the engagement from above, and that is more the, let's say, the private side of the house with a view, but the entry condition has this fairly kind of muscular tectonic of this cantilevered concrete wall coming out of a landscape that is largely opaque. There's only a single window for a bedroom on the second floor, but this was meant to kind of provide them a tremendous amount of privacy and protect the room that is beyond. Essentially, this is the kind of an all-purpose room, dining room, living room. It's a very small house with a view from the kitchen looking out to the landscape. And so in the finished iteration, there's this really kind of wonderful relationship that the building has to the landscape that in fact somehow feels very natural right now. But truthfully, this idea of integrating a building into a landscape has immediate consequences during construction. So we had a very cavalier contractor. One looks at you'll know the absence of shoring and the deep rear side of this. But it's jarring at first when one starts building, like the abstraction that we might have in academia when we speak of integration in landscape, when the reality of integration begins with something like this. And in this case, there was a fairly modest budget, so the way in which we employed details had to be very strategic. And so we're seeing here concrete formwork, the formwork of which is very standard residential formwork, and then there's only moments where there's board form lining the interior of this residential formwork, which is meant to, and you'll see in the subsequent image, you can now see over here the landscape coming down off of that wall, and this boardwork produces a kind of matching pattern to the cedar and the transition to this edge to the back patio. This also marked a kind of a unique opportunity for us to deploy our interest in digital fabrication, and it's certainly one of the projects in which there's a tremendous amount of sweat equity. A lot of this was produced directly by us with the assistance of many folks like this guy, Kelly Doran, if you recognize him. And this is a 1/3 scale model of one of the elevations in which, given that there was a kind of this idea that there would be at points certain radically open and exposed views out to the landscape, other parts of the project would in fact embrace privacy, and for us that meant opacity. And so there was a chance to play with the idea of these field conditions within the house. And so this meant that in fabricating this, there were a lot of considerations to be made in terms of the machining time, and there were a lot of studies respective of how quickly we could machine something like this. And the pattern was meant to pick up. There's a gradient pattern pulled around all four sides of the uppermost volume. Were meant to kind of exploit the temporality and changing light conditions throughout the day. The siding was one opportunity in this project, and the other was a stair. And the stair, in fact, operated under the very simple premise of kind of cut profiles that encase, in fact, the underside of a simple switchback stair. And this kind of marks certainly an interest that we have to deploy such technologies at moments of thresholds or points of engagement, the points on projects that we see and that we touch. In fact, this is happening at the entry to the house. And so this is something that we fabricated it and installed ourselves. And it also kind of marks an interest that within much of our work there is a kind of perhaps a certain restraint in the overall reading of a project with a kind of more potentially exuberant geometric kind of exercise within. There were other moments that we took opportunities within the house to kind of look at the supply conditions for air within the systems. And so, whereas that was one of our early projects, a project that we're working on now, and that one that is kind of partially under construction, and as soon as the snow melts completely will be completed, is a project up in Fox Lake. And this project in Fox Lake, in fact, looks at the typology of the Korean Hanok. And one thing about the Korean Hanok is that it's so one of its iterations, in fact, has a mountain on one side, a river on another. It has a north-south orientation. And we are privileged, in fact, to kind of have that opportunity for that orientation on our site. And so we see, in this project, Richard referred to it, we were fortunate to have received a Kane Architect Award this year for the house. It's really just an extraordinary site that allows us a kind of sectional engagement that we of course relate to with the incline topography, but there is there is something, even with the geometry of this, where when considering the Hanok, I'm going to show this image first, which normally has this kind of inverted roof feeding into a courtyard that it has various kind of programmatic purposes. That in our case, the conditions and the amount of snow did ask for us to kind of invert the condition for the roof to be able to shed snow. And if you can see in this section here, the inversion produced a kind of very interesting reading, this kind of mimetic relationship of the landscape. Of course, you enter at the upper level, but the kind of movement of space is very much parallel to the overriding section of the site. And so we can see, rather than having the inverted roof within, we now see this roof kind of having a kind of a normative pitch in some regard, but feeding in sense the sense of an interior courtyard within the space itself. And so these are some rather crude model photographs, but they show the kind of entry condition from above, which is a very different reading from this side. Essentially we enter in this corner and then descend into the main spaces within the house with this upper tier, this L-shaped part of plan being a master suite. So this is the upper floor and the entry condition here. This is the master suite. There's a descension down into the main space here with an opening view to the landscape and this kind of flanking. And then in some regards, there certainly wasn't a desire to have an open air courtyard. So in fact, there was a lot of adaptation, but there's a sunken moment within the space with the dining area, which is the receiving portion of the light of the skylight above. We see a rendering of one of the iterations of the scheme, and a second iteration. Now, there was the house in Frog's Hollow, which for our practice is fairly iconic, and then there is the Galley House. And the Galley House was Don's first project, and it marks our move in some ways, and the move in this talk to kind of back to the city. And what's curious about this is that in today's market, someone will look at this house and see tremendous value. a lot of money if someone would pay for this house. Not so long ago, this was a very much a problem. A house like this, for example, for new construction, you have to deal with setbacks. And there was something very radical about this proposition. And of course, as I'm presenting this, every time I talk about this project, I just imagine Don thinking all the different things he would say about the project, by the way. So like, it's hard for me to kind of get through this, but it's like, so I'm going to give my own reading of it. But what's extraordinary about this is that the removal of the existing house produces then this new house, which is less than 12 feet wide, and has a kind of extraordinary frontal condition of transparency. A transparency, of course, which would be that a client would have to be quite amenable to in terms of the openness to the street. But this openness to the street is the thing that I absolutely love about this house, and because in fact it's the investment of kind of receding the skylights in the space kind of produces a backlight condition for the glass. We see the stair in the front. The stair is kind of operating actually to provide even lateral support for this double height space, and so it actually has a purpose. It also is supplying light to space below. Don can draw very well. This is we are curiously of a bridging generation, I think, Betsy and Don and I, in which we were trained by hand and used computers, which is kind of good because as the partners in a practice, we're not divorced from the tools of which our fabulous employees are slaving away at every day. Showing the exterior view again, this is the interior view of the stair, and the kind of, I think what's really simple about this is that how prominent and the real estate is with this view, that the stair kind of gets a very special moment within this house, and there is an attention to detail that is really admirable. And then, the notion of thresholds and handrails in the house, I think, are quite extraordinary. And then the notion of livability. There's a double height. Interestingly enough, this house is located on a street called Galley Street. It has a galley kitchen, but its title is not related to this. But a very livable space, and a space that established tremendous traction for our practice and for other projects. So as an example, there's this notion that with the galley site, it was an existing narrow condition. So now we see another house, in fact, which has an unusually wide lot. And through some negotiations with the city, there's this idea of of splitting the lot, selling the existing house to help fund this house. And it's curious here because we're manufacturing our own density and a certain belief, and in dealing with this narrow condition, there are a lot of incumbent issues, particularly the idea of getting light into the middle part of the middle aspect of the program is a challenge within narrow lots. And so we see the front elevation here, and I'm going to show a zoning image from the city. I'll make a comment back to this image when I show that image about the similarities. And I'll show you a couple of images, but this house is kind of dealing with a narrow lot, but it also is engaging I'll say it's a certain typology of us having certain walk-up conditions where, in fact, we're not looking to program a house with all of the broader programs, the living room, dining room, and kitchen on the same floor. So in this case, the owners were very amenable to a notion of dedicating the entire ground floor to the kitchen. And so it produced this kind of extraordinary through condition within the house that admittedly has an austere presence in that most everything that can be hidden is hidden. And this in some ways kind of forces the aspect that there's a living room on the second floor, which we see here in plan. But the view on the left, what's interesting for us here is that there's this knife edge condition here. There's a structural moment where, in fact, this is in tension getting pulled back for this cantilever to occur. But this knife edge on the front is carving back, here we see it in plan, to provide light to this inboard bedroom. And so even with this very small move on the front, it's kind of addressing what are really some of the base challenges within some of the narrow lot typology in Toronto. And so this is the rear elevation. Don does not like this image because it's not complete exception, but it's really a wonderful image where we see there was, in fact, a kind of, the house was pushed forward out of respect of maintaining this tree in the backyard, but in the master suite in the top, there is this kind of recognition and of this kind of receiving geometry of the tree and this view of this window from the bathroom on the top. And we see, on the top floor of a house something like this, that we see a much more modest deployment of detail, something that's really quite simple, where we have trim and things like this. It's very different than the dedicated millwork that we find on the second floor. I mean, on the first floor in the kitchen. I mean, so with this walk-up, this notion of the walk-up typology, a project. This is another project that we have in the office. Is that that we were asked to kind of this project's in Forest Hill, in fact, and it's a very onerous. Basically, somehow they've established the zoning bylaws where one has to go to committee of adjustment to build a house of even modest size, and I think a lot of it has to do with trying to avoid building much larger houses. And there are a lot of lawyers that live in Forest Hill as well, so there's a lot of resistance and things like this. So this client did not want to go to committee of adjustment, but he had a very strong notion of the size of program that he needed, which far exceeded. So this is sort of what can be built in some ways, and that's what he wanted. At this time, the city, this is what I was referring to Blantyre's case, is that the city is existing zoning bylaw, which is has its own reasons that this is called the main wall prior to the pitch, has a much lower maximum height for flat roof buildings than for pitched roofs, of course. And this by far is the norm within contemporary architecture within Toronto. I mean, it's as if it's like it's disturbing in a way that some intern at the city opened up SketchUp and just kind of did this, and that's it. That's modern architecture. But one thing that's key here is the 7.2 meters, and so we see on this site, for example, that so a flat roof thing could be this tall, a pitched roof could be this tall, and we're trying to stuff so much program into a site that was going to be very limiting without getting a variance for this. And so looking at kind of a very straightforward condition of having two floors within the house, kind of a very normative condition, the idea of using a basement, the floors below for a lot of the program, and then embracing certain notions that operate within the zoning bylaws of the city. So we can move up the ground floor 1.3 meters, and then all the space below doesn't count against your GFA. And what does this provide us? Well, even in considering this kind of shift, the one thing that we wanted to do in comparison to the existing houses in the neighborhood is that to invert the program. So rather than, like in this house, having the living room, dining room, kitchen on the ground floor, and then all of the bedrooms above, one of the struggles that you have in doing that is that you're always looking to have those ground floor spaces have greater amenity in section. And so the challenge is trying to make those spaces grander, kind of impinges upon these spaces above. These spaces above are often compartmentalized with walls. What was interesting for us was the possibility of pushing all of that program, the kitchen, the living room, the dining room, to the top of the house, and having the bedrooms be on the floors below. So we see in this diagram, for example, the top floor, is like exuberant. You can dance, you can work below, and you live. And there's a very significant thing that's happening at this level where you see a bump out for this sunken garden. And we see a bit more of a developed section. This actually receives a part of this in terms of working the GFAs. It receives a garage. This garage is particularly tall because it has a mechanism to stack cars within it. And So the house gets jam-packed with this program, but the most significant thing about it, in fact, is the resulting elevation is that the real focus is at this upper level, which is here without the roof, that we see this very open space. And this open space now can receive all of the geometry that's afforded from the pitched roof. So we're kind of reclaiming the attic space into kind of one big space, and so we see the kind of the top of the model kind of flipped upside down. And this is the resulting space on the inside, looking toward the kitchen. This is a kind of a fairly elaborate millwork wall with a bathroom beyond, and a view looking the other direction as well. So the geometry of the space is largely a reflection kind of opening up the skylight above. It has a bit of a twist to kind of to directly kind of catch light, and it's these flanking views in this perspective which are kind of extraordinary, very unusual for the context, because in fact this is normally the realm for bedrooms and not for living rooms. And I should note, coming back to this, of course, is that I think that zoning permitted us about 1,800 square feet, and we have about 4,000 without as of right in this proposal right now. A very new thing in the office, of which, and we have at least 3 projects now, which are kind of looking at the notion of multi-generational living. I imagine that this is happening with a lot of architects in the city, but we have it presents a unique challenge for a number of reasons. Often limited budgets can be very difficult, respective of all of the amenities that are required for for parents and various generations of families to live under one roof. I'll come back to this in a moment in terms of site. So the city kind of outlines all of it, but by definition, the types of houses that can exist in the city. And that's not so important as this right now. Like with this diagram, is that what we were interested in doing for this proposition is that one looks at the end, like what all of this equals, is that there would be 2 rentable units. There would be a unit for the parents. So the blue and the green are separate from each other and separate from everything above. The yellow and red are separate. They're connected, but they're separate programmatically. And this would be the proposition for this housing type. And so now we see in a bit more of a bit of a way that we see our 2 apartments below, and now we see this pink kind of program wrapping around the yellow. This ended up changing when they actually occupied the house, but I'll speak about that in a second. The house, and this is actually on Huron Street, just south of us right now. This is wrapping up kind of slowly. The house itself has a very clear section respective of kind of passive energy performance. There is a kind of a direct stair within the main unit that feeds into an operable skylight above. And this operable skylight is significant in that, of course, it promotes kind of pulling air through the house. But it also acts like this kind of bump up right now. Of course, this isn't occupiable, but it looks to kind of hold the corner for the site and maintain very similar kind of heights to the existing fabric. I'm saying that because in the hands of a developer, this site would have seen much greater density. If you had seen this house prior to it starting, there was that image of the house in the corner. For years, it had someone had spray paint on the side of it. Build a condo here, please. And but the family that owns this site didn't have an interest in developing the site in a way. It was a very personal interest that they had. They were interested in the income that they could bring in. So the project acts something like a blowfish. In fact, it makes itself much bigger and occupies a lot more of the site than in fact it's in fact under 3,000 square feet. Part of that is that there is a garage below, and then there is this exterior courtyard, which reads from the outside, one wouldn't know that this is a courtyard, but this kind of helps to kind of maintain and kind of stick the density in the site. So, we see now that what's happening in the composition here is that they're fairly large windows respective of, I mean, very simply, respective of programs. So this is, you know, a window for the apartment below, window for the, very large window for the parents' unit. And then there's something very curious here in the master bedroom. This window is lifted up. I do have another image of this. This is an early rendering for the house itself. And the plan, this, you know, in this case, all that one is taking away from it is that there's a wrapping. This is an apartment on the ground floor, so the entry is on the Grange side. This is Huron, so this is the entry to the main unit. And the second floor now, we are within the realm of the family itself and the master bedroom above. The house are in construction. We actually don't have this project properly photographed yet, but that'll be happening this spring. There's a wonderful stair. This is a kind of miniature model of this that is kind of integrated within. We'll have wonderful photos of the stair, which is built, which is really one of our, given the fairly limited budget for the project, was one of our moments to kind of, you know, explore kind of an interesting moment of millwork within the project. So it is an incredible site. Many of you probably walk by this every day, but like it's just crazy. Somehow everything about this image is what this part feels like, and you know, this one, you know, and they have, like, you know, in the context of the city, the views from the master bedroom to the CN Tower are really extraordinary. And I'm mentioning that, in fact, we had to kind of make, I mean, already within this house, if one is kind of, there are these big moves on the outside looking to kind of make the house kind of hold the corner better. There's already another house under construction next to it, which is a certain responsibility of kind of, like, I mean, let's say to the urban fabric and, like, you know, maintaining a corner. It's an early kind of, you know, model for the space that, you know, Don standing next to this window. So, you know, using this kind of exaggerated geometry with the master bedroom and lifting this up, one opportunity this is that this is a transition moment. There are beds over here in this bedroom that you're walking to the bathroom here, is that this window is high enough and it's large enough for a view, but high enough to provide a sense of privacy where one doesn't have to be concerned about closing the blinds and potentially very compromising times. So on the multi-generational front, we have another house outside of the city, and this house is very much under construction right now. And the curious thing about this is that it's a huge site. You know, the garage for this is like there's a 3-car garage. The 3-car garage is bigger than some of the houses that we currently have in the city. And so, you know, I mean, it's not that we aren't excited about the project, but the possibilities, the formal possibilities on this kind of larger site were really exciting. But there's something very significant. There's a beautiful creek on the back of the site. And it turned out through discussions with the clients that basically they wanted every room to have a view of the creek. So very quickly the house became a very linear house with all the views toward one side. So we ended up with some very interesting restrictions. You know, again, with a formal accused now, this kind of large L shape is largely dealing with a garage for the site. And the road, I mean, although it's a very beautiful site, particularly on the rear of the site, the front road has a lot of traffic. So there was this kind of desire to kind of maintain opacity and privacy from the front. And so we see then in a series of sections, this is a cut through this is beyond the garage, but looking through the front of the house, that not dissimilar to the dog trot typology, not an open breezeway, but we have a single view through, and you'll see in a moment that this is the dining room here, is that there's one moment that, that we see through the house into a courtyard, a flanking courtyard, and to the trees below. This is a section now moving a bit deeper into the plan that this is the connection, and this is the dining room area, and we can begin to now see the degree of transparency and opening up through the house as we kind of cut deeper. And so now there was a strong desire to have the kitchen be separate from the rest of the program for a sense of privacy and to prevent sound attenuation and things like this. So we see that on one side, the reading of this section, the kitchen on one side, the living room here, and in plan I'll show us in a second, this in fact, this multi-generational component, this is an entire unit for the parents. And so one thing that is significant about this house as well is that in terms of their aging parents, there's a concern of accessibility, so the house is on the ground floor is entirely at one level. There was one demand from the client too that came, is that the bedroom had to be cantilevered. And so we see deeper back into this section, this is the cantilever and the view out to this landscape. So from the front now we see in this rendering a kind of this notion of the single view through, but the relative opacity of the project of the front. And in plan, the dining room acting as a bridging component flanking this courtyard, the matching and extraordinary height of the kitchen becomes a kind of sculptural move for us here in section, in the master bedroom and suite and a kind of family room above. So the rear of the house, in fact, is quite open. We see much more glazing on the rear, with the only exception being this double height space for the kitchen, which you'll see in one moment. So these are kind of all developmental renderings, essentially, and a view to the kitchen, across the courtyard, still across the courtyard but toward the front. And the stair that connects, this is one of the tall spaces within the house itself. And I think what's going to be, in perspective of the house in Frog's Hollow, is that I'm only showing, in fact, this stair and that stair, is that the stairs have certainly become one of the very interesting opportunities for us to, in some ways, intervene within a project and kind of look at kind of explorations of geometry. So I'm going to begin to wrap up here by discussing like a bit of change of scale for the office. And I'm only going to show, in fact, two projects, and I'm only going to show one image of this project. This was a recently completed proposal, not proposal, but a cafe for pilot coffee roasters. It's not actually a cafe. This is a tasting space. I should note. And this space, interesting enough, which is on Wagstaff. I encourage everyone to visit this space. It's really lovely, and they make extraordinary coffee. Is that the bespoke industry, right, for things like coffee is really kind of exploding right now. And it's amazing how much interest that this project has garnered for us, and you will be seeing quite simply more commercial spaces from us and kind of master planning strategies associated with things like this. Now, even with a project like this, what we're kind of looking to do, this unfortunately didn't make it in this iteration. In fact, you can see the stools and other things here, but is that we do seek to kind of find opportunities within sometimes very limiting circumstances for modes of exploration. So in this case, these were meant to be not cafe tables, but tables for another purpose, that looks at a reciprocal structure within a self-similar profile for these wood profiles, and we see a view from this below. Now, that kind of breaks the kind of the stride of the lecture perspective of kind of moving up in scale, but it's just more to show that we often look to kind of deploy certain opportunities within projects. And so the last project that I'm going to show, in fact, is a master plan that we have in the office for Abbey Gardens. And Abbey Gardens is a fairly extraordinary community that is looking to both cultivate their own lands, but also educate people in the modes of agricultural production for self-sustenance. And its site is incredibly interesting because it's an abandoned quarry, and so this notion of land reuse is really extraordinary. And we see in the initial master planning proposition that there in fact are a series of buildings and one that I'm going to focus on right now is this building which has the kind of the title of the cradle, and this is occupying one of the main quarry pits, and it we'll see it here in the kind of in this view on its own, and this is the main building for the greenhouses, and it has a spire, this kind of food spire. This is kind of the, let's say, the education node within the master plan. So within the spire, this is where classes are taught for growing food and for teaching about cooking, for example. We see the greenhouses here in the master plan. There's a performance arts theater, and there's a marketplace for the sale of produce. But looking at the cradle, we see this kind of notion of kind of a deep integration into the landscape. Again, the green growing fields that just sitting on top in this section. I'm going to show another set in a moment, but that and a very smart section respective of, there's a bit of a riparian landscape, passive strategies respective of air moves in the space and captures both heat and sun for the growth in the greenhouses, and this is the food spire itself, which in fact even produces a kind of extraordinary pull of air through the space. And this master plan has had us look at a number of things, particularly the growth schedules, the manner in which the building would be used over time. And in some ways, and it's a bit of a reach, but there's this kind of notion of replacing the economy of the quarry with an economy of production of food. And so there's a bit of correlation respective of what how robust the landscape can be once it is remediated to become both productive for the production of food and for the local economy. And we see within this plan as well that this is the marketplace for the selling of food, this is the performance theater. I mean, all these are kind of very schematic propositions. And this final thing, this is kind of the entry building, the welcome center of sorts for this property, of which a number of kind of it's intentionally very, very open in plan, that kind of becomes the symbol for the site, and I have a hard time looking at this because what they actually built on the site is not this at all, and we they built something else. And we're like, that is awful. So we did this to show them what they could have. It's interesting that way sometimes with our clients. Like, that, you should have asked us, and we could do something like this. And so this is a bit of a painful image respective of what was built on the site. This is the last image. I'm going to say that tonight I feel like in presenting the work here is that it's been so long since it's very much a show and tell for me. And it can be difficult sometimes to position our work respective of common threads. So maybe scale isn't the best way to discuss our work. It seemed appropriate tonight, but the one thing that is missing is that there's a tremendous amount of built work that I'm not showing, and I struggle with that too, because as a kind of young practice, we're constantly having to prove ourselves. I mean, it's one thing about having a practice that we're capable of doing things, that we're capable of building, and in part in kind of showing the scale now. I don't know, it could be another 10 years before I give another lecture here. Is that I'll mention like what the future holds, and some things I'm not even at liberty to show, but in fact we have a number of master plans underway, including this one, but a master plan for a ski club in Ontario, 60-unit housing in the city, an urban block within the city, and 2 breweries. And so in part I'm saying that because if we are actively pursuing a change of scale for our work in an environment which is very difficult in Toronto, for example, for an office like ours to get larger work. And so we are doing this through very private channels, and I certainly hope that in the years to come that the scope of work will change, but the spirit of what we've done so far will kind of be a part of that work as well. Thank you. Yeah, the interesting thing is I have been giving students a hard time now for a long time. 16 years. And in giving a talk here, I fully, I appreciate that, that students are always having to put themselves forward for criticism. And I equally will accept it from you.
Thanks. Shane. Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Hey. I have a question about scaling, the problems and the challenges of and the complexities of scaling when you move from the small to the big, but excuse me, more in terms of the design geometry. I wonder if you could comment on how you decide and struggle with the evolution of scale against geometric complexity, and when certain geometries are not working at a larger scale, what are the different agendas or agencies that take place at a larger scale that are different from the smaller in your practice?
Scale is an interesting question. I'm going to answer this. I'll answer your question directly in just a moment. But I'm first going to say that when I started teaching here, I very much kind of represented new modes of fabrication and thinking about geometry, and I'm still very much invested in those ideas. But I found that maybe the older I get, the more curmudgeonly I get, the more doubtful I become that that we should be looking to mill a building, with like everything is like this, like the singular process of something about this, right? And I say this, by the way, because there's Benjamin sitting right here who's like, all he wants to do is 3D print a building, literally 3D print a building. And I very much like the incumbent issues associated with limitations, in fact. And sometimes I find that the problems of kind of what it takes to kind of make a building kind of largely get skirted with the notion of fabrication. So having said that, around scale, often what you're seeing in our work is the scale of what we can afford, and it's not just it's a bit of a money issue, but the access to technology. So we, curiously enough, are extremely skilled office, capable of operating at very different scales, but limited more by the budgets and scales of our work. So we reside like in this kind of domain where I think that we have far greater capabilities. There's another thing though, is that I tend to kind of think about our work as often having a certain didactic relationship between like the notion of those things that are orthogonal and those things that are curved, where it's never all one thing or another. If you see in our work, there's often some sort of juxtaposition between an investment in geometry and, let's say, an investment in some sort of internal geometry, but perhaps the restraint of the overall piece itself, if that makes sense.
It was a great pleasure to see a lot of work that I hadn't either seen or seen explained in the way you explained it. I don't know how many people in the room had the chance to go and see Peter Eisenman on Friday night. He was awarded the Topaz Medallion, and he gave a somewhat odd lecture where he talked about the loss of governing authorities in architecture, and he talked about. Did you see that?
No, I did not see it.
But he talked about starting to study the 1950s and how all the Frank Lloyd Wright books were by his desk, and that all of the authorities that he worked through, and decried this sort of naive search for originality among the generation today. So I have a kind of an odd question for you, because when I look at your work, I know. I have a sense for the internal discussion, the evolution of all of your ideas, but it also evokes a lot of other work for me. And so the houses of William Worcester, or some of the Venturi's early work, Alvar Aalto, many things. So I have a kind of funny question: what you guys are looking at now? And some of the Swiss architecture, contemporary Swiss architecture that we all admire. So I wonder if you would share with students the sort of things that you are looking at, either historically or in the contemporary times, that you find interesting or important today.
I mean,
if you can.
well, I can say this. I mean, it's a. I'll say this generally. We sometimes, we make an argument for austerity. And then we have this this discussion about North American culture and like whether the austere Swiss box somehow is not as interesting when it's not in Switzerland. There is this question. And we look at, if we could not put flashing on a house, we'd love not to do that, and we see these, we have magazines in front of us and we're like, this is wonderful. We don't want to have these lines appear. We want to make all of this go away, and somehow it comes crashing down, and either someone, not, wanting to take the chance of, their house leaking or things like that. But, I would say that there's a lot of our work which is as inspired by our I'm going to say our generation, but it should come as no surprise that the first place that we traveled was Finland, for the Rome Prize, for example. And we have tremendous respect. I mean, although that there's a tremendous respect for Aalto in Canada, let's say. We still don't shy away from our own kind of interest in looking at Aalto's work. Having said that, when you mention someone like Graves and something like this, I actually don't find that there's much, not that Graves so much about irony, but there's not really much irony in our work right now. It's like, it's often quite serious. I mean, like, Jim was here, Jimenez was here. God, I'm just like, I'm just way too serious. That's all I'm thinking the whole time. Jim's giving us a talk. He's like, oh, God's work is just so kind of serious in a way, But then I find that the literal is kind of interest to me. So I mean, there's abstraction, but there's a part even when Jim was kind of giving a presentation when he was saying that his work was kind of like something, but then I was disturbed. I didn't want to challenge him, but it's like what? But it wasn't something at the end of the day. It was just kind of like something, But he was referring to work which actually had direct references to things. I think in our own right, I mean, there are certain typological studies that we look at, but we don't operate under a particular trope. So whether it be Aalto or something else, I don't think we've ever staked a claim in a particular project in that regard. But there was I can tell you, it's like with tremendous trepidation that I show, not that much trepidation, but this image, that has this kind of like Aalto-like thing in this thing. The kitchen actually looks nothing like that right now. This was it's curious. That was kind of like a stand-in, like an idea. Oh, it's gonna be a designed thing in the kitchen. It'll be up here, And so you have this kind of cut, but it has since changed. And really, it's that existed because there was kind of this wonderful moment in this section for us to capture light. Yeah, what's curious about that is that Paul, who is sitting here, is responsible for stuff like this, and it's curious because the modes of representation as well. I mean, the one thing that I can note, like with Brian's question about geometry, which I answered in kind of a different way, is that we still tend to do everything on our own. Like all of the visualization and drawing, everything that we do comes out of our office. Like we have not farmed out a single thing yet, respective of design or representation. And John, it's interesting that you mentioned this because in fact, all of these images before I got my hands on them had all color and I of course like they're all black and white and I pinch them down. And then yes, it's that teapot which bugs me to no end, right? Like its specificity is such a problem in representation. We're also because I share that. It was meant to be. It wasn't meant to be the focus, but now that you've mentioned it, it's all that I'm seeing right now as well. Yeah. Thank you.